Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, as if you've read the abstract, which I presume, presumably is why you're here, you know that I've made a translation of this poem. So I'm basically going to take a deep dive into the poem and sort of through the poem introduce you to Amīr Khusraw. I'm not going to give you a biography of him. You'll learn a few facts about him, but that's not really the purpose of the talk. And I imagine most of you are unfamiliar with any medieval world, right? So in a way, the broader aim is to give you a glimpse of how, in L.P. Hartley's famous words, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, right? This is true of Khusraw as well, right? So, so the challenge in trying to introduce Khusraw's most ambitious poem, his most thematically diverse and also the longest. It's 459 pages in the only print edition. Poem is that nothing quite like it exists even in Persian, leave alone medieval English or French or other medieval literatures that one knows about, right? Its outermost shape in its most immediately recognizable form, it's a masnavi, right? It's a masnavi of 4,487 end-rhymed couplets. Masnavi comes from, the word is, it names a Persian genre, but the word itself etymologically derives from the Arabic word for two, ithnan. So it's basically, it's like a doha, I suppose, if you want a North Indian equivalent. In a uniform meter, it's of indeterminate length, right? It was the most high prestige form of narration before the novel, okay, in the Persian, not just in Persian, but in Urdu, Kurdish, Armenian, Georgian, all of these languages in the shadow of Persian, so the greater Persian world. So just to give you two examples that you might have heard of, thematically disparate to each other, Rumi's classic, which is a Sufi classic, but you also have the Shahnama, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, the latter not being Sufi at all. So it's sort of that, the thematic diversity gives you a sense of how supple the form was, right? How manipulable. And what makes it manipulable or made it manipulable was that it wasn't codified, So like in Sanskrit and in Arabic, classical Arabic and pre-modern Sanskrit, meta-literary discourse, right? Prescriptions on what you should do with literature, medieval manuals of rhetoric, for example, focused on the shloka in Sanskrit, but also the baith in Arabic and Persian, the couplet, right? All prescriptions were, the largest semantic unit for them was the couplet, which means you were free to do whatever you wanted on larger scales. But at the level of the couplet, it was a frame in which you could display, kind of a miniature frame in which you could display your mastery of tropes, or figures of speech, and by playing on them, right? But you were far less constrained at a narrative level, at a level, larger than that of the couplet. So the typical Masnavi couplet is made up of two sentences or clauses, one for each line, or hemistic. Only exceptionally do sentences spill over from one couplet to the next, right? So in this poem, whenever Khusraw has a sentence that spills across 3 or 4 or 5 couplets, it's because, well, it's a moment of exaltation, a moment of high narrative suspense, when something very momentous is taking place. Only in those moments does he sort of, that you have enjambment, right? Khusraw composed 10 Masnavis, right? Of these, 5 make up a quintet that retells the quintet of Masnavis by Nizami of Ganjaz, a great 12th century poet from northern Iran, who was sort of the inaugurator of the romance genre in Persian. The 5 others, however, of which this is one, are unusual. They treat episodes from the careers of the 5 Delhi sultans he served, and they innovate on, and innovate on literary conventions and forms, right? So if you take, this is a passage from the first chapter, which is the 9th sky. Now, as you know from the abstract, the poem descends from the outermost sphere to the innermost sphere, right? So the 9th sky is the first chapter, and the first sky is the innermost sky, right? So in this passage's title, notice Khusraw's appeal, a speech and audience before the throne, then on my own affairs, hopeful of fate. Every chapter, every sky or chapter is in a distinct meter, which is not allowed normally in Persian or Arabic or Turkish, but it's normal in mahākāvya, in Sanskrit poetry in cantos. Sanskrit courtly poetry in cantos. The most high prestige genre of courtly poetry in Sanskrit is the mahākāvya, often mistranslated as epic. And there you're expected to switch meters from meter to meter, and in fact theme to theme. And although Khusraw never says it, there's no other equivalent for, or no other counterpart for this sort of metrical, for a polymetric Masnavi where you switch meters as per theme than the mahākāvya. So it's very likely he got it from there. And so the meter of this particular chapter is called the Mutaqarib. It's also the meter of the Shahnama, the Book of Kings. It's a meter associated with events from the public life of a court. It's a very famous rhythm. It's a heroic kind of rhythm. So perhaps the only, I won't read out too much Persian, but I think you should hear some, right? Just to give you a sense of how it sounds. This meter, okay, it's the Mutaqarib. It's the same meter as the Shahnama. I'll read out just this passage, but the original. Shaha ganj bakhsha karam gustara ma'ani shinasa sukhan parvara mara umr ka shast bala guzasht hame pish shahan vala guzasht. It's not how you necessarily read it, as when he declaimed it, but that's the rhythm. Basi bandagi kardam az own bakht kamar baste dar khidmat char takht ز شاهان کسی کاولم کرد یاد معز دنیا بود شهق قباد, and so forth. I won't read, it'll take up time. Now, in this passage's title, notice Khusraw's appeal to fate, even as he appeals to the king. Who is in power, fate or the king, fortune or the king? While the king imagines he decides on human affairs, it is fate or divine predestination that supervenes over his decisions. This is one of the meanings of the scheme of the nested or concentric spheres, according to which the poem unfolds. It miniaturizes even royal action by containing it within the celestial spheres that condition it. Much have I slaved by fortune's assistance, Khusraw says, drawing on the idiom of military slavery that was central to the Turkic slave sultanates of North India, Afghanistan, and Mamluk, North Africa, and Syria. Right? These were, you would have heard of the slave sultanates of Delhi. Fortune or fate has allowed him a career of distinguished or dignified servitude, implying that he is not wholly enthralled to the king he serves, since it was fortune who allowed him such service. So notice the passage. Of kings, the first to give me patronage was Kayqubad, exalted in the world. Then, by the turning of the turquoise sky, I was held in esteem by Firuz Shah. Then, when I took to eulogizing kings, I grew rich by Alloy's high treasure. This passage alerts us to the function of kings in this poem. Exalted in the world, Mu'izzat Dunya, literally glosses Sultan Kayqubad's title. The phrase turquoise sky similarly takes literally the first part of Sultan Firuz Shah's name, since Firuze in Persian means turquoise. And high or exalted plays on the literal meaning of Allah, the first part of Alauddin Khalaji's name. These puns identify these men with their offices. These men are not really individuals, they are their offices, right? Making it part of the duty of each to reward Khusraw's eulogies with wealth. The king Khusraw now serves is no exception to this rule of fortune-aided obligation to a courtly servitor. Now that fortune has become my intimate, the world's axis, Qutb, has become my benefactor. The word axis or Qutb puns on the first part of his Sultan patron's name, Qutbuddin Mubārak Shāh Khalajī, right? Who was then young man in his 20s. But this should keep us from expecting realistic treatments of kingship in this poem. The poem presents heavily idealized images of historical persons and events. So, maybe just 1 second before I get to this, just say a bit, these are highly idealized images of historical persons and events. How do we understand the poem's relationship to what we and its medieval readership considered history, right? Dynastic politics and events in courtly life. I think the best way to do this is to use a distinction. Made by Ernst Robert Curtius, the great medievalist, in 1948. In this book, maybe you should turn your phone off. So, in this book, Curtius distinguished between classicism and mannerism. Right? This distinction is sort of long consequential for the fate of scholarship on medieval European, but also actually Arabic literatures as well. Classicism is language that's clear and in accordance with the rules. These are his words. Making moderate use of rhetorical devices and hewing to a diction in keeping with its topic. By contrast, mannerism is language that mainly refers to itself, even as it seems to refer to a reality outside itself, right? This kind of concept is central, central to my argument, right? Mannerist literature aims to produce a discord between signify and unsignified, between signs and their meanings, using reality as only a catalyst to set into motion an autonomous set of relations between linguistic signs. This is an argument that a famous Arabist, Stefan Spörl, made for Mamluk Arabic literature produced at the same time as Khusraw, but in North Africa and Syria, where real events, an invasion or the siege of a fort or a coronation or the birth of a prince and so forth, were used as just pretexts for language to explore language, right? That's what mannerism is, whether in the visual arts or linguistic arts. And it's obviously not peculiar to medieval Europe and the Islamic world. It's sort of, yeah, it's an aesthetic phenomenon that you find even today. The bulk of Amīr Khusraw's oeuvre, like that of his Arabic counterparts in Mamluk North Africa and Sanskrit counterparts in India, is mannerist. This shared stylistic predilection for mannerism allowed Khusraw, as I will show you in a bit, to produce Persian equivalents for features of Sanskrit courtly poetry, right? He sort of, in this poem is in a way a kind of a creative reaching for equivalences to certain key features of the mahākāvya genre, but in Persian, right? Okay. But this is only his mainline tendency, the mannerist tendency, right? There are, I think, at least three chapters in the poem that are not mannerist, that they adhere to a classicist equivalence between reality, poetry, and poetic convention. Okay, and I'll later offer a few reflections of the political meanings of this mainly mannerist style. Let me now turn to the outer structuring principle of this poem, right? This is the principle of the nested celestial spheres, right? That you know from the abstract. The poem's 9 chapters of skies replicate the geocentric model of the cosmos medieval Islamic and Hindu-Buddhist societies inherited from the 2nd century Greco-Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy, right? Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos has this sort of Eurasian reception history. It's based on observational astronomy, naked eye observation, the 5 planets that you can see with your naked eye, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, to which Khusraw adds the sun and the moon, and then he adds the sky of the fixed stars. These are the stars against whose fixed positions the movements of the planets can be measured, and the sky of the universal intellect, or the first intellect, right? This is a distinctively Neoplatonic concept, which I'll get to in a bit, right? The poem, as I said, opens with the outermost sphere, that of the universal intellect, first intellect, and descends by degrees, 1 to 9, to the innermost. The innermost sphere is that of the moon. This is crucial. Khusraw and all of us live in the sphere of the moon. We live sort of in the sublunar sphere. What characterizes sort of the chief difference between, the significant difference between life in this, beings that inhabit the sphere of the moon, the sublunar sphere, and all beings that are above it, is that the sublunar realm, whether in medieval European imagination or in this world, is subject to mutability, right? Is subject to birth and death. Things, as in Aristotle's phrase, this is the realm of generation and corruption, right? The flesh decays, right? You're born, you grow up, and you die. This is not true of all beings in the realms above the sublunar, right? They are eternal. Okay, this is the sort of basic presumption that if you've studied Shakespeare, at least kind of the traditional way, the way I did in my BA, you would know Tilliard's The Elizabethan World Picture. That also rehearses the same schema for Elizabethan England. Okay. Okay. So, what does this concentric planetary scheme allow him? Right. You don't see it in his other works, but you see it sort of full blown as a outer structuring principle in this poem. There's an inner one I'll come to later. What does it allow him? Why did he choose this? Why this creative choice? Okay. The poem presents itself as a verbal replication of the universe and claims in each sky to improve on its original. Okay, so if you look at, these are the opening passages of the very first sky, which is the 9th, the outermost. Okay, the first intellect, or universal intellect, is the first entity to come into being in all Neoplatonic cosmologies, pagan, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, when God, or the One, contemplates itself. So from God's reflection upon God Himself, is begotten another being, typically from the 2nd century AD onwards. Neoplatonic sort of thought identified this being, second being, as the active intellect, the first intellect, the universal intellect, different words, different ways of translating it. And all subsequent emanations are products of this dual relationship, right? Where the first intellect reflects on itself and God. So you have a triangulation, and then a kind of a quadrupling and a quintupling and so forth. Okay. All other levels of skies are products or byproducts of the first intellect's reflections on its relations with God. These lines present a version of one of the oldest images of the work of literature in pre-modern Arabic and Persian, an inorganic and thus immortal verbal simulation of, an improvement on, an organic and thus mortal original. Right? So if you see, he says, the lofty sky that's loftier than the rest encompasses 8 others in itself. I fashioned a new likeness from that realm. that the remaining 8 might well with joy. As this sky sprang from the first intellect, it shows me the first intellect's mien. As this is a likeness of the first sky, shadow forth figures of that first veil. Furthermore, he says he's fashioned this verbal likeness of the outermost sky so that the remaining 8 might well with joy. Here we see another image of the literary work, of the work of literature, which is of venerable antiquity in Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit, which is literary creations, works of literature, are heterotopias. They are parallel worlds, parallel universes, within this one, tucked away in this one, right here at your disposal, but in which the laws of this world are pleasurably suspended in favor of other laws, right? So, is literature escapist? Is medieval Sanskrit Arabic literature, the main line of it, is it escapist? Well, yes, but only in the sense that it perfects a defective original, right? So unlike a fantasy novel today, which you think of as escapist, but you don't read it assuming that you will see the world you live in, the everyday world, perfected in it, right? But here you do. That's the assumption you make here. Literature improves on life. It doesn't reflect life. Life is defective. Literature is perfective. That's the basic assumption that runs across. It's not just, this assumption is not peculiar to pre-modern. You see it in Latin as well, right? So, okay. Here are the opening lines of the third sky, which is the 7th from the top, right? So, this is the sky of Saturn, Shani, and therefore India, right? He's drawing on Hindu astrology. Yeah, I'll let you read it for yourself. So notice how Khusraw refers to himself, the bottom, right? He says, though Saturn inverse its connection, the sky's connection, with me, makes what's malign of your benign. Saturn's India's planet primordially, whence I'm Indian by virtue of Saturn. Okay, he's claiming that Saturn's ancient malefic, inauspicious associations are overturned simply because he happens to be composing the chapter and because of his Indian nature, right? Clearly, he's not being scientific. This is not how medieval astronomy looks, or even astrology looks, actually, right? So is he being megalomaniacal, right? The tone suggests otherwise. It's too hyperbolic to be serious. Consider the lines immediately after these. Okay, with my heart's help, I'll well with subtleties, like the uncountable gifts of Saturn. When I charm Saturn down by such magic, I shall gift it the fortune of Islam. He claims he's going to convert Saturn to Islam, right? Whatever that means. Agog at my word sorcery, it will spontaneously proclaim faith in Islam. What kind of emotion are these supposed to generate to a medieval reader, right? Since it doesn't resemble what medieval astronomy and astrology look like, it's bravado, right? So what are we supposed to smile? Well, what is a medieval reader expected to feel, right? Now, poetry is conventionally thought of in medieval Arabic, Persian, and other related literatures as licit magic. That's the phrase used. All other magic being, let's say, black magic. Poetry is white magic. Poetry is licit as opposed to illicit magic. And he claims that by this licit magic, he will convert, Saturn to Islam. The emotion such hyperbole is meant to invoke in us is charmed amusement. We're not supposed to take this literally, right? This attitude of charmed amusement, right, of delight, is the key reading attitude associated with a very important noun in medieval Arabic, Persian, and actually pre-modern Urdu as well, even 19th century Urdu, which is the word adab, right? You kind of can't read, you wouldn't know how to read this if you didn't know this kind of umbrella term. It's a very famous term. Broadly, it refers to this sort of ensemble of ethical practices, rhetoric being central, not the only, but the central among them, by which you shape yourself according to models of virtue, right? Taking control, then connoisseur. Connoisseur is important. This is not, let's say, a democratic form of ethical self-fashioning. This is a sort of, it is an elite form of self-fashioning, but not necessarily a class elite, always, right? It is a gendered elite. It's, androcentric. It doesn't only involve men, involve women too, but it's very male-centric. Taking control and connoisseur pleasure in literature, above all poetry, was a key trait of adab. Such pleasure was less about scientific or religious truth and more about shared enjoyment. Hence the salience of poetic assemblies, mushaira, majlis, in all cultures of adab, right? So, okay. Here's the opening passage of the 5th sky, which is the sky of the warlike planet Mars. Khusraw gives most of this chapter to an ingeniously punning conversation between the Sultan's bow and arrow. Here too we see the claim that Khusraw's sky improves on its original, right? So if you look at it, here's a likeness of it that I've set down. I have traced out the sky upon the earth. If that sky is the hunting ground of Mars, it pacifies its quarry for this guy. In other words, Mars pacifies the animal it's hunting for this guy. It places its quarry at the disposal of this guy. Okay. How does Khusraw's sky improve with the original? It does so by interrupting Mars's normal behavior, which is to shoot arrows of misfortune in the title. Right? Instead of Mars, it's Khusraw's arrow-like pen that will hunt down singing nightingales, but also work as a black-hoofed deer. This is a closed circuit. The pen draws figures that it hunts, right? You produce the quarry that you hunt. Khusraw calls this, you see in the passages after this, I too in this connection well aware, composed for the king, a book of the hunt. The Shikarnama, the book of the hunt, is a genre, medieval genre. But if you actually read this, expecting to learn how to hunt, you'll learn nothing, right? And wherever there's a sweet voiced nightingale, I will hunt it by this book of the hunt, and so forth. So that the black-hoofed deer of my reed pens leap and prance in it out of happiness. So although Khusraw claims to have composed the Book of the Hunt in the Sky, a subgenre of princely advice literature, we will in fact learn nothing of the technicalities of hunting from the sky. Nor did his royal reader expect to learn anything technical of hunting here. What they would have expected and received is linguistically wondrous reflections or the ethics of military service implicit in the conversation between the Sultan's bow and arrow. Right? I'll come back to this later, but just for now, maybe actually just wait a moment. But Khusraw also locates himself in the first or lowermost sky, which is the sky of the moon, as I said. In Perso-Arabic as in medieval European literatures, both of which inherited Ptolemaic models of the cosmos, the sublunar realm, as I said, was one of mutability in contrast to the eternity or fixity of all the skies above it. So if the poem, this whole poem, Nine Skies, arises out of an author subject to mutability, as Khusraw himself makes explicit by his many autobiographical references to his old age, he was close to 70 at this point, and sinfulness, then this puts into question the immutability of the higher skies, right? If this conjuring illusion arose out of the lowermost sky, where there's an old, frail author who conjures it up for us, can we really trust what he conjures up in the skies above that of the moon, right? So is this perhaps why Khusraw often speaks of himself in this poem as a conjurer, and this poem is a magical illusion? Consider these lines where he takes pride in his art of illusion. Now that I've set forth all my excuses, behold now the breathing of spells and charms. The 10th proof, this is the 10th of 10 proofs, I think, yeah, in the third sky, the sky on India, the third chapter on India, the sky of Saturn, which proofs that India is actually paradise on earth. That's what he's offering. Okay? But the word for proof here, dalil, is a word used in theology typically for proofs of the reality, existence of God or the existence of the prophet and so forth, or existence of prophecy. It's a rational discipline, medieval rational discipline, but he's not using it, the way he uses it resembles nothing like the way the word would be used in medieval theology, right? So it's kind of eccentric. And this is, of course, I'll talk about that later. He basically ransacks the jargon of neighboring disciplines and makes clever use of it, which tells you something about what literature is supposed to do in this milieu, in this sort of discursive economy, right? I'll come to that later, right? Okay. Oh, okay, good. Well, I do have half an hour, so it's the first couplet here prefaces his so-called proofs in Sky 3, that India is paradise on earth. The phrase spells and charms, I've just highlighted it, signals that what we are about to read is far from the sort of rationally verifiable proof that traditional Muslim scholarship sought for reports about the Prophet Muhammad's statements. It's in fact a dizzying list of hearsay and rumor that's meant to charm us like all good adab. The next 3 verses are also boastful, anticipating the final sky, the innermost sky, where the planet Mercury does descend to serve as Khusraw's amanuensis. So in the very last sky, Khusraw looks into a mirror. He can't see himself because, he says, I'm unique. There can't be anyone like me. So there can't be a likeness of myself. And the planet Mercury says, don't worry, I'll come down and take dictation, right? And so this poem is, in fact, Mercury plays Ganesha's role in the Mahabharata, right? He takes dictation, right? So anyway, it's a kind of, it's a delightful conceit. That no Khusraw that no poet like Khusraw exists under this old sky, as he says, is true actually, insofar as no other poet in pre-modern Persian composed a single poem in such a range of genres, innovating on each of them, and in such a range of meters. In a previous sky, Khusraw had claimed that his poetry was commensurate with the payment he received for it, and in another sky, that his poetry was priceless because God had singled him out by fate. But now consider this verse. Okay, this is from the final sky, the innermost sky, the sky of the moon, that conveys his shame over having spent his career, recall he was close to 70 in 1318, on conjuring by words. Here he contradicts himself, saying that neither he nor his art are worth one trifling coin, and that the king's favors are only noblesse oblige that won't keep his trifles from obscurity later. Right? The king gracious accepts my worthless words, but what will my trifles be worth later? All of my life's been spent on noxiousness, not once did my heart tend to wakefulness. And further down he makes a very important allusion. I'm the cave's dog, I want to wake from sleep. I'm Nakshab's moon, I want lack for luster. Okay, why this diametrically opposite attitude to his megalomania earlier? It's because he's ashamed of having been what he calls a sinful Muslim by having spent his life on conjuring illusions, right? But what does this really mean? I mean, the Muslim world has always had poets, so why would he be ashamed? It's not explicit, but the larger world of Islamic learning, the world of letters, does inherit a distinction first made by Plato, in Plato's Republic in particular, and Gorgias, these two dialogues by Plato. The distinction between rhetoric as truth-speaking and rhetoric as persuasion. Right? So you might recall, if you know some Plato, that Plato was afraid of the sophists, okay, in Athens, who used, or according to him, abused language to persuade people regardless of the truth. And in a way, there's a classicist to argue that Plato actually invented the concept of the soul to argue that whereas rhetoric persuades the body or sways the body by swaying the passions, philosophy, which also uses language but is not rhetoric, addresses the soul. Right? Anyway, this distinction, this sort of tension between two visions of what ideal language use should be, passes into the medieval Islamic world as well, right? Okay. The phrase, these two allusions. Cave's dog alludes to an incident in chapter 18 of the Quran, right? The chapter of the Quran titled The Cave. And in it, you have the companions of the cave. It's drawn from Christian lore. In Christian lore, it's called the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, one of whom may have been a dog. These 7 sleepers sleep for such a long time that in God's gaze, humanity finds its ability to comprehend time challenged. It then admits to God's omniscience and the certainty of the day of judgment. Okay? So that's the allusion, which is so, what does that mean for him? It means he's been heedless, morally heedless of God. He hasn't been a dutiful or dutifully pious Muslim. That would be the first allusion. That's kind of the implication of the first allusion. The Nakshab's moon, the second, the one I've highlighted, alludes to a trick that an 8th century magician, Al-Muqanna, is said to have performed. He made a moon-like globe arise up from a well in Nakshab. Nakshab is a city in Central Asia. Each night for 4 months. Why did he do that? Because he hoped to impress people into following him instead of the Abbasid Caliph, right? And by behaving, in other words, like a false prophet. Right? By performing a prophetic miracle without being a prophet, right? And tricking people into following him, however temporarily. So Khusraw is implying that he's actually been, a false prophet, he's been conjuring, tricking people. But the Ptolemaic scheme of the nested spheres also allows such misgivings. Khusraw's choice to situate his narrative of the Sultan's military victories in the first 2 skies, that of the universal intellect, the first intellect, and the fixed stars, implies a fixity or immutability to them. Because as I said, all the levels above that of the moon are characterized by fixity, by immutability. Their very location in the poem's design underscores the triumphalism of their rhetoric. As I said, this grand illusion of the 9 skies is conjured up by Khusraw, who lives in the innermost sky and is subject to change, like everything else, in the sublunar realm. What's more, if the first 2 skies are domains of immutability, why does the triumphalist Muslim rhetoric of the first 2 skies focus intensely on wondrous transformations in the course of battle? This is from the first sky. Okay. This is a passage describing the actions of the Sultanate's Turkic warriors on the soldiers of Yadava Devagiri. Devagiri is Deogir in Persian, but Devagiri is northern Maharashtra, I think, northern Deccan anyway. The capital, sort of, fortress, almost impregnable at the time, capital of the Yadavas of Devagiri. Notice how the first couplet presents a miniature spectacle of hard steel becoming swift water. The sword kept flowing like rushing water that jets sharply out of an aqueduct. Okay? The comparison in the second couplet, in that pressing swarm, the swirling lancet ran like the tooth of a comb through dense hair. The second couplet, what does it do? It conflates domains, the metaphor, right? A battle scene becomes a scene of cosmetic adornment, and a sword runs through flesh like a comb's tooth through hair. The next couplet, the third one, also presents this sort of conflation of domains. By blades forked like lightning across brave backs, jewels sank into the bezels of... The bezel is this sort of, sort of platform on which a ringstone sits. Okay? Swords sinking into backs at war are jewels settling into bezels and jewelry. Similarly, human body parts become building parts. In this, swords scalloped livers like arrow slits, forged steel like livers, suffering body's pain. The swords that gouge livers out of bodies, leaving wounds like arrow slits, take the place of livers, whose role in medieval Islamic physiology was to produce blood. But the original phrase in Persian for like livers, suffering body's pain, jigar khware, also carries its literal meaning of liver eater. Consider the next couplet. Each stone that the sun had failed over years to transform by its heat into rubies was transformed instantaneously by swords of solar brightness into ruby shades. Okay? As per ancient belief, it's a Hellenic belief, passes into the Islamic world. Rubies were products of the sun's prolonged action on stone. But here swords speed up the process, right? Rubies here are a metaphor for blood, obviously, right? Well, not obviously, but the context lets you infer that, right? The word for instantaneously, biyik dam, also means by one blood, because dam in Arabic means blood, so it's a bilingual pun. A pun enabled here by the sanguinary context. Again, we see a sudden and unnatural transformation of states formulated in a compound metaphor that collapses domains, battle and mineralogy. Finally, the last couplet. In that blood wave where horseshoes turned molten, the raven by its red beak turned a parrot. Battle is a state of, battle heat melts horseshoes and transforms ravens into parrots by blooding their beaks. Battle is a state of wondrous inversions, and these descriptions of wondrous inversions correspond to a trope classified in medieval manuals. The trope is called qalb al-mahiyya, it's inversion of substance, right? So it's actually, these are performances of taxonomized figures of speech. They're not completely original in their... Why would he be obsessed with transformations? How things turn into their opposites? Well, it's because this was a prized figure of speech, right? But what assumptions does this passage make? It assumes a narrator who is minutely observant of sudden transformations, but physically uninvolved with them. So if you, the idea of a disembodied eye, right, a single eye, sort of minutely observant, almost like a drone, or like a fly on the wall, right, is also the gaze assumed by Mughal miniatures or Persian miniatures, whether from Iran, Central Asia, or India, right? You're not supposed to have a body when you look at a Mughal miniature. You bend over it, you peer into it. It's not on a wall, right? It's embedded in a book. And so you look into it, it sort of suspends consciousness of your body. It's supposed to. And you become a disembodied eye. Of course, you are the structural equivalent of the king who looks down at the miniature. And it's a gaze of mastery, right? It's a gaze that inspects minutely from a position of immobility, everything taking place, all these, inversions, and experiences wonder, right? That's the emotion that you're supposed to experience. I'll come to that in a moment. These are simultaneously transformations of states of being in the real world and metaphorical transformations of one semantic domain into another. Battle into toiletry or cosmetics, battle into jewelry, battle into architecture, battle into mineralogy, and battle into bird appearances. Now, if you sort of step back and ask yourself, what was the most influential and famous theory of metaphor? And this is a metaphor-obsessed poet. What was the most famous theory of metaphor in Khusraw's milieu? It was Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, great literary theorist from the 11th century, writing in northern Iran, in Jurjan, writing in Arabic. And he wrote this, one of his two major sort of monographs. It's called Asrar al-Balagha, The Secrets of Eloquence, which is the sort of most extensive discussion of metaphor we find. And Jurjani comes up with a theory of why we find certain texts beautiful, right? He explains the emotion of beauty in response to certain kinds of language, right? He basically argues, to kind of condense him, that we experience beauty in language when metaphors conceal their predications. In other words, when we don't know what it's a metaphor for, and then it obliges us to work. It places an exegetical burden on us to figure out what it's a metaphor for, and that sudden, moment of realization is beauty, right? So, for example, when we read this just as an example here, each stone that the sun had failed over years to transform by its heat into rubies was transformed instantaneously by swords of solar brightness into ruby shades. We don't immediately know what these rubies are until we extrapolate by the battle context that they are blood. Jurjani claims that this passage from ambiguity into clarity is what we experience as beauty. Such beauty, then, is closely related to the emotion of wonder, which medieval Arabic and Persian literary theory prescribed and described as the aim of literature, as the emotional aim of literature, right? This was the emotional aim of literature across many genres, wonder. But what about historical reality, right? I mean, this is Sultanate fighting the Yadavas of Devagiri. In fact, the Yadava dynasty comes to an end. The Harapala Deva is the last king, and so forth. Is it realistically probable that Khusraw witnessed swords scalloping livers from bodies or bloody-beaked ravens suddenly looking like parrots? Of course not. But this is why I say that reality, or zones and segments of reality that interest these militarized Persian-speaking Turks, right? This is literature by and for an elite militarized male audience, minority. That's the world this is from, right? This is why I said that reality, zones and segments of reality, is only a catalyst that sets into motion a system of comparisons internal to the Persian language and its literature. In other words, mannerism. Like his probable model in mahākāvya, or Sanskrit poetry, in cantos, Khusraw's poem is most mannerist in its battle scenes, and thus also the least classically realist. You remember Curtius's distinction, the least classically realist at these points in its plot. So if you look at a brief, I wanted to give you an analog for a sort of family resemblance to mahākāvya, right? I translated a few verses from the Vikramânkadevacharita. This is almost certainly not a work Khusraw knew personally, and he was very interested in Sanskrit, but it's highly unlikely he knew any. But that's not the point. The point is, there's a family resemblance. He would have known of mahākāvyas, and all mahākāvyas do this, which is they treat real events as I said, as pretext for the exploration of tropes themselves. Let me just pull up my own. I want to read that out, and I want to read out the Sanskrit to you. It's an interesting, and I'll read out. You have my translation there anyway, but yeah. So this is from Bilhana's Vikramânkadevacharita. This is Karnataka, Kalyana, the court of Vikramaditya VI. Bilhana was a Kashmiri poet who came sort of via the Gujarat coast and ended up employed in this king's court. So, it's lexically dense in an equivalent way to Khusraw's own poetry. Tatkumbhikumbasthala china pishta vipatalo vari nidir babhase apuritash chola balakshayotha rakta pagananameva mandalena tasmin samakarshati chapadandam veera prakande vijayodyameshu mukhanya bhuvan ravidangananam ushnamoshna nishvasa vidusarani. Incarnadine, the sea of red lead, that's sindoor, flowed from the lobed brows of the elephants of this king, gleaming like blood rivers and spate from the slaying of the Chola army. That celebrated hero who had no sooner drawn his bow on his victory marches than the faces of the warmly gasping Dravida women, that's Chola women, paled. Okay? Similarly to Khusraw after him, Bilhana uses a real war between his patron, the Chalukya king, Vikramaditya Tribhuvana Malla of Kalyana, and the Chola kings to innovate on a Sanskrit poetic convention, Kavi Samaya. What's the convention, the first verse, that's innovated on? It's the convention that elephants ooze ichor, or ichor, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, from their temple lobes. You see this across Kavya. When in rut, an elephant is in must, it oozes ichor. But instead of ichor, these elephants gush with red lead, sindoor, that gleams like rivers in spate with the blood of the slain Chola army. That's the innovation, right? The second verse, the mere flexing of his bow leads Chola women to gasp and shed their luster from fear. This is Atishayokti, hyperbole. It's a play on the familiar Sanskrit trope of hyperbole. Khusraw is no different when it comes to war. Does all of this mean that we should read Khusraw indifferently to historical context? No, because it depends on what we mean by historical context. The sort of dynastic and political history that preoccupied Persian courtly chronicles is only faintly relevant here. What does Khusraw's poem actually do with what we independently know were politically significant events? I mean, politically significant even for his colleagues, even for him. It's not just we who consider, let's say, the Sultanate's invasion of Devagiri to be politically significant. His own colleagues writing history at court, not poetry, thought of it as significant, right? What does the poem actually do with historical events? I'll give you two examples. This is from the first sky. The second sky sets up an elaborate dichotomy between the Muslim Turk and the idolatrous Hindu. Consider this passage, okay? The passage makes a categorical military distinction between Turk and Hindu. saying that Hindus should fight only each other because they will scatter before the Turk as naturally as butting mountain goats scatter before a wolf, or fighting cocks before a falcon, or stags before panthers. He naturalizes this opposition, right? But what do we know of the historical reality of this invasion? We know from the chronicle authored by Khusraw's own colleague, Ziauddin Barani, that the Turkic side was actually led by a general called Khusraw Khan, who was a Gujarati convert to Islam. He wasn't a Turk, right? And we know from the historian Richard Eaton that what allowed the Sultanate's army to prevail over the Yadavas of Devagiri and the Kakatiyas of Warangal was superior siege technology first developed on the Iranian plateau. Neither was the Turkic side quite Turkic, and nor was the Turkic victory fated by nature. There was nothing natural about the actual victory, and nor was this an actual face-off between Turks and Hindus. I mean, Hindus, yes, but that was not the nature of the faith. That's really not how the people fighting actually saw themselves. Why does Khusraw do this then? Right? I'll come to that. Maybe I'll say a bit, because he sets up this elaborate hierarchical dualism. The Turk, the light-skinned, pious Muslim Turk versus the dark-skinned, inchoately black, infidel Hindu, only to overturn all of it in the third sky, and then celebrate the Hindu, and then call himself a Turkish Hindu, right? Or a Turkic Brahmin is also what he calls himself. So he's drawing on a well-known opposition, well-known from history writing, which is triumphalist. All these quotes, I mean, it's not modern history writing, right? Ziauddin Barani and so forth. They're triumphalist, imperialist chronicles. So is Bilhana's chronicle of Chalukyas, right? But Khusraw's sort of larger motivation is to take up these hierarchical dualisms. This is only one of them, the Turk versus the Hindu. There are many others across his works: man, woman, human, animal. What are the others? Yeah, I mean, these are the main ones. And then overturn them, muddy them, right? Take a second example. This is actually Yadava fortress. The political context is as follows. The Syuna Yadava Raja, Harpaladeva, Harpal in Persian, is executed on the Sultan's orders for having violated the tributary agreement the Sultan's father, Alauddin Khalajī, had imposed on the Raja's predecessor, Ramachandra. This much Khusraw himself tells us, and we know as well, right? How does Khusraw represent the death of Harpaladeva? At once with him, they stepped into the flames, hell stoked to a firestorm by their kindling. All those moths catching fire turned the smoky sky by their heat into a fire temple. As all the moths have vanished into fire, may the world's candle ever leap with light, the august king who spears with virtuous skill, our flames leaping in victory's candles wake. The first couplet refers to Harpaladeva's generals who commit suicide by entering his funeral pyre. Khusraw presents this event in terms of the ghazal trope of love-crazed moths leaping into the candle's flame. But we know the historical reality was that this was a case of the South Indian practice of Velavali, dating back at least to the 9th century and peaking in the 13th century. Landed border guardians pledged oaths of allegiance to die with the lords they defended. Kesavan Velutar's words, this involved loyal servants, generally soldiers, laying down their lives on the occasion of the deaths of their masters. These servants were known as Velavadichas. They took an oath of unswerving loyalty to their masters, and when the latter died, they followed them in death. But this poem isn't interested in history. It's interested in using historical events as pretexts to explore the reality of literary tropes. Here, the trope is not only that of the moth and flame, sort of ghazal trope, but also that of the vaguely Zoroastrian of pagan fire temple, and rooting such tropes in praise of the Sultan, whose spears, as he says, are flames leaping and victory's candles wake. And yet, reading these tropes against the historical reality lets us infer the political subordination that enabled them. What Sheldon Pollock argues about Sanskrit literature applies to classical Persian too. The political power of literary aesthetics lay in its apparently timeless and placeless prestige. Apart from this outer structuring principle of the nested spheres, there's an inner one that I mentioned. I'll just talk about that now. The inner one is the idealization of the Perso-Arabic qasida or panegyric, the praise poem, right? This is a very famous genre of poetry and high prestige genre. The qasida is the oldest and most high prestige genre of Arabic and Persian. It predates Islam, and it remains the most high prestige genre till around the 14th century when the ghazal displaces it. The first part, you need to kind of understand the basic structure of a qasida, Kotli qasida, to see what Khusraw is doing with it. The first part of any qasida, any praise panegyric, describes what you might call the production of value, right? Something valuable to an elite male courtly society is being produced. Wine, with the purchase of slaves, the branding of horses, the weaving of silk and so forth, right? They're luxury goods usually. While the second part praises the addressee, the patron addressee. The transition from the first part to the second part is what's called, what translates from Arabic and Persian as flight, or a swift move. And the skill with which you transition from the first part to the second was something you were judged by as a poet. How did it function ideologically? It functioned by setting up an ideal template, an ideal typical template in the first part, and then obliging the patron in the second part to live up to that ideal, right? So you put moral pressure on your patron listener to live up to the ideal set up in the first part. That's kind of basically how a qasida works, right? Every chapter and sub-chapter of Khusraw's Nine Skies ends by praise of the king as if it had been a qasida all along. So that all of the prior explorations of India's languages or Sultan's bow and arrow and all of these various topics come to seem as if they were preludes to praise for the king. This leaves almost no room for the Sultan as an individual. He's almost nothing but the axis holding up or upholding the 9 turning skies. Take, for example, this passage from the 4th sky, which is this, I'll come to that, which is the sky of the sun. I'll come to that now, actually. The 4th sky's main theme is the festivities surrounding the birth of Prince Muhammad. Prince Muhammad is Qutbuddin's son. He's an infant, too young to actually write, but it imagines this child learning calligraphy in a kind of subjunctive mode. It imagines that the child would learn calligraphy, and it then moves serially through the prince's anticipated calligraphy lessons in the Arabic alphabet. Its ingenious visual puns imagine him tracing each letter, making each an anticipation of his royal victories as an adult. This is not a medieval account of childhood, really. It's an account of how this baby will be a proleptic adult, and these are proleptic, anticipations of his adult royal victories, right? So, take the first couplet. Aleph is the vertical stroke you see just next to Aleph. If you draw Aleph with a pen, certainly a medieval pen, your hand would be up, would be sort of erect, right? It would itself be vertical. And so the couplet imagines its tip rising sky high. The word for lunar mansion, Iklil, it's a 17th lunar mansion in astrology, begins with the letter Aleph. And it's a metonym for the heavens here. The next couplet plays on the shape of the letter Jim, which if you see, even if you don't read the script, you know that it looks like an ear with an earring, right? By convention, slaves wore the earrings of their masters. So the couplet claims that the prince would enslave his tutor by writing this letter, this letter of the alphabet. The next couplet plays on the fact that the word for wisdom, hikmat, begins with the letter he. In the next couplet, the words for beauty, khubi, and calligraphy, khat, both begin with he, right? The phrase for the tops of olive trees, the word for olive is zaytun in Arabic and Persian. In the next couple is the visual pun for the first letter, on the first letter of the word for olive, zaytun, which is zay, right? As well as in the phrase Hijaz's margins, the last letter of the word Hijaz is zay again, right? So literally its margin is zay, right? And the tax in question, the jizya, right, is the jizya, which is the capitation tax a Muslim ruler could levy on non-Muslim subjects. In the next verse, the words for fashion, sazad, sword, safe, and point, sar, all begin with the letter sin. The next verse, which is the one, when his pen leans towards the shape of Sheen, the core of Kashgar falls in line for him. Kashgar is a city in Central Asia. It's the most visually ingenious because it plays on the shape of the third of the 5 letters making up the proper name for the Central Asian city of Kashgar, namely Sheen. Sheen is literally the core of Kashgar, so it falls in line or submits to him. Since the word for line, khat, literally also means a calligraphic stroke, this couplet entwines calligraphic and political meanings, right? Like you'd say in English, he fell into line, obeyed. Kashgar falls into line, but it's also the calligraphic line, right? Finally, consider the last couplet. When they teach him to wield lance reeds, he cleaves Kaf's heart like inkstand tops with his lance tips. Now, the word for Kaf, the word Kaf, Kaf is a legendary mountain range that envelops the horizons, right? But its orthographic heart is the letter Aleph, right? If you cleave Aleph, if you knock off Aleph, you get Kuf. Kuf means high ground, a hillock, right? So the verse implies that his pen's lance, the sword of his pen, has sort of cut down a mountain into a hillock, right? The word for inkstand, meme, is also the name of the letter meme. If the first letter of the word meme is cleaved or removed, it yields the word yam. which means ocean. The couplet thus also implies that the prince cleaves the ocean's head with his lance, just as he cleaves the heart of Mount Qaf, leveling it to high ground. This kind of metaphorical ingenuity, visual ingenuity with the alphabet, wasn't, and not just the alphabet, but most of these metaphors, you notice, are actually visual metaphors. It's a heavily visual poem. This kind of metaphorical visual ingenuity wasn't new in Arabic and Persian literatures. Khusraw wasn't original in this respect. But we can't get a sense of Khusraw's innovativeness except against the backdrop of such metaphorical ingenuity in Arabic and Persian. Consider, therefore, these two short poems from a genre that scholars of Arabic writing in English have called an epigram. They've called them epigrams. The first slide is by a 10th century Baghdadi poet, famous for his, he was anthologized for his epigrams. I included the Arabic and transcription just to give you a sense of, even if you don't read Arabic, the elegance and the formal concision with which he worked, and how this is therefore a kind of formally self-contained poem, right? But for the title, you wouldn't know it's about an oven, right? This wondrous object, which is an oven, whose base has been inhabited by the sister of the sun, fire, of course, and which the Majus, Zoroastrians, worship. It's a quotidian oven, which takes in the moons of white dough and gives out the suns of baked bread, right? This riddle-like poem, it teaches us nothing new about the oven, but it lets us see the transmundane in the mundane, the wondrous in the ordinary, right? This is one of the central aims of the epigram as a genre. The riddle of the second epigram is equally hard to solve, but for the title, right? Which lets us imagine the humble pen as someone blind and world-seeing because it writes of the world, and deaf and speech-comprehending because it transcribes speech. Again, we know nothing new about the pen, but are left amused by this miniature hyperbole. So too this epigram by a poet writing a few decades after Khusraw, came in from Central Asia to Delhi and was Muhammad Shah Tughlaq's court, Badr Charge. This is equally hard to solve, but for the title, which lets us imagine the humble pen as someone blind and, a gilded, the pen, he says the pen is a gilded snake with the musk, of course, the musk is black ink, right? And 100,000 ants, but these are the letters. And the moon is the paper, right? So what do these epigrams do? They conflate domains, writing and snakes, right? Or baking and celestial bodies, as well as scales, right? The kind of microcosmic scale of human writing, let's say, or baking, and the macrocosmic scale of the skies, right? Each of these is a freestanding feat of metaphorical substitution. But Khusraw goes beyond this by juxtaposing many such metaphorical substitutions into a list that transforms the meaning of any one member of that list. If earlier Arabic and Persian literatures emphasized metaphorical innovation, Khusraw, like his counterparts in Mamluk North Africa, emphasized metonymy. This, I don't think, is true of mahākāvya. This is a feature peculiar to Arabic and Persian. Consider how in Sky 5, the bow, I said there was a conversation between the bow and the arrow, right? This is the bow describing itself or abasing itself before the arrow. The bow says, this much curved body is a withered branch, a stick in a body and with ends drawn in, heat curls through me and I spring back restless, wetness spreads in me and I turn graceless. Here the bow scorns its own gaunt and withered body to the arrow and puns. The word for restless, bi-tab, contains the word bend, tab, and the word for graceless, bi-ab, which also means dishonored, contains the word moisten, ab. Now look at how the arrow, in reply, reinterprets these same physical features of the bow. It tells the bow that the heat and cold it suffers serve to make it the arrow's servant, that the bow's makers deceive and torture it to make it serve the arrow with back doubled perpetually. The same set of physical properties in the bow, recalling epigrams in their condensed metaphorical ingenuity, shift in meaning because of the dialogical frame. What were snapshot metaphors and epigrams are here metonymically dynamic explorations of the ethics of military servitude, right? So step back a bit. In his 1938 classic, Homo Ludens, a study of the play element in culture, the medievalist historian Johannes Huizinga argued that as societies come to rationalize and segregate their practices, they lose touch with the exploratory and rivalrous spirit of badinage at their origin, when such distinctions did not yet exist. A spirit he calls the play element, and that, quote, only poetry remains as a stronghold of living and noble play, unquote. Khusraw's poem returns its medieval readers to the ethical ambiguities of the military slavery that was central to the Delhi Sultanate, ambiguities that were papered over in the Islamic jurisprudence and history writing of his milieu, but playfully set forth in the dialogues he stages between the bow and the arrow and the Sultan's polo stick and polo ball. In doing so, the playful arguments that are one major unifying thread across the nine skies also innovate on a medieval Perso-Arabic genre with origins in the ancient pre-Islamic Middle East, namely the dispute between a pair of culturally salient items that's eventually resolved by a third character superior to the pair. Right, so across medieval Arabic in Spain, in Syria, and of course in Persian as well, 11th century Persian already, you have dialogues staged between, this is the bow and arrow, but you have dialogue staged between spring and autumn, old age and youth, the Persian and the Arab, the pen and the sword, right? These are well-known pairs, culturally well-known, and by the end of the dialogue, when someone comes in, a third person comes in and resolves the dispute, a whole set of cultural tensions and values associated with that pair have been explored, right? That's the kind of social function of the genre. Yeah. But whereas Khusraw's medieval models are disputatious from the start, his bow and arrow begin by complementing each other, each abasing itself before the other, and only then fall out and insult each other until the Sultan's general reconciles them by saying they're both necessary for the Sultan's army, and by placing the arrow besides the bow. By this point, the conversation has playfully explored a spectrum of ambiguities to do with military service, while avoiding the categorical clarity of jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence, and the ideological simplifications of courtly chronicles. This gives you a sense of the function of poetry, right? In especially long-form poetry. Actually, not just, even the ghazal, even sort of short lyric, long-form poetry, in this sort of, in the rhetorical landscape of not just medieval Delhi, but Persianate world at large. This was one of the key functions of poetry, and Khusraw exploited it to the hilt, which is to take up the hierarchical dualisms that frame jurisprudence and history writing, say the Turk and the Hindu, or man and woman, or human and non-human animal, or of course master and slave, and muddy them, sort of mess with these distinctions, right? Okay, I'll conclude now. In the years before his death in 2003, the literary critic Edward Said composed a book of essays titled On Late Style. This is where I get the title of my talk from, in which he explored across a swathe of Euro-American literature and music, cases of artistic style that were marked by unreconciled hostility to reality as the artist knew it, even at the end of the artist's career. Something like this is true of the Nine Skies. A career-long pursuit of word sorcery seems to have left Khusraw, even in his late 60s, proud and ashamed of himself by turns. Sorry. He berates himself for his sinfulness, with which he does, sinfulness, but the puns with which he does so put his shame into question, right? The puns are not apparent because I've over 900 footnotes in my translation. That's my translation. But, you know, of course, I'll explain them to you here, right? See, this passage continues, okay? These are the punning, the blue verses are the punning ones. My drum roll of glory throughout this realm is just my knocking of two leather cups. I'll talk about that in a moment. So, you know, the word for drum roll in Persian, dabdabe, right, also means glory, but it twice repeats the word dabe, which means a leather drinking cup, right? Apparently the Sultanate had leather drinking cups. But since leather cups they don't clink when you knock them against each other, his fame is actually silent. He's not actually famous, right? His musk and dark smoke are metaphors for his once black hair that is now as white as camphor, and the sign of light, okay? And the sign of light, this phrase, ayat-e-nur, alludes, of course, to the Quran's chapter, the light, and thus to spiritual awakening. The word for childhood, uftad, also means a state of helplessness, and thus also describes old age. Old age is a second childhood. It also means fell, the past tense of the word fall, a sense the next couplet plays on. The second line puns on the literal meaning of the word for renown, sarfarazi, as in Urdu, it means head exalting. The tension between these puns and their own formulations of shame is the price Khusraw pays for a career-long commitment to the primary reality of linguistic shapes in the sublunar or created world, to rhetoric as persuasion rather than rhetoric as truth-speaking, right? You get the sense across Khusraw's oeuvre that, you know, below the level of God, below the level of the first sky in a way. That's why the first sky is almost free of puns. You know, beyond God, all that is other than God. In that realm, what is primary are in fact linguistic shapes, genres, figures of speech, and so forth. But he's deeply conflicted about this position. He's ashamed of it throughout. He's been sort of playing with words and linguistic shapes throughout his life. It's this tension inscribed into the very texture and structure of the nine skies that ultimately distinguishes its thematically diverse unity from the Arabic and Persian encyclopedia genre that flourished in the 14th century. The post-Mongol world in the 14th century was full of encyclopedias. The encyclopedia is the arch-imperial genre because it catalogs, in a sense, everything in the realm of the king and places it at the king's disposal, in language. You think of the encyclopedias in this milieu, you think of, famous Nuwairi's encyclopedia in Arabic from Egypt. You think of Manasul-Lhasa, the Sanskrit encyclopedia that Chandan has written about, and more geographically distant European encyclopedias like the 13th century Great Mirror in Latin by Vincent Beauvais. Unlike any of these, the Nine Sky keeps rooting its thematic diversity, or unifying it in a sense, in Khusraw's own labor, by foregrounding his own labor, his individual circumstances, his courtly address to the Sultan, who is the axis of the world, and his sense of himself as the most versatile poet in the Persian language, but also therefore a sinful magician. Okay, that's the end of my talk, so I'm happy to take questions or comments. Yeah, so if you want a quick run through, it wasn't time for it, but this is a kind of quick run through of the skies. Anyway, the major themes, the meters, but this is more descriptive rather than argumentative, so I didn't want to spend time on it. Anyway, if you have questions, please go ahead.
Hi, it's me.
Hi.
I'm not much into poetry and all, but I grew up listening to a lot of Khusraw's pahelis and and in my family. Later on, recently, somebody interpreted that chap tilak and all.
Could you just speak up a bit? It's not very clear.
Somebody recently, I was talking to a right-wing historian, and they kind of interpreted the chap tilak poetry as a conversion, celebrating conversion song, as a halfway house between Hindu and Islam and all. And the kind of dualism you talked about, kind of cement and kind of steel man that argument. So I'm a leftist by kind of disposition, but is there a...
It's not, are you asking me to comment on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, all the Hindavi or Hindi poetry, macaronic, poetry, and all the poetry that's not in Persian, it's actually not by Khusraw. It's attributed to him. It dates probably no earlier than the 17th or 18th centuries. It goes back to Sufi dargahs and musical communities which tried to authorize themselves by speaking as if they were Khusraw. This is a model of attributive authorship that Bhakti literature.
All the Braj Bhasha poetry, pahelis and all,
None of it is by him.
It's
attributed to him. I will say, so the model is, it's exactly like...
Is it the reason why the pahelis and the riddles don't have such vivid metaphor in Hindi? Like in his Braj Bhasha pahelis, the metaphors are not as vivid as what you said.
Yeah.
It's not by him. It's a lie.
Yeah, but it's not because they're not by him. The metaphors are also, the thing about using metaphors in any pre-modern literature, you can't be original about the semantic domain. You're not supposed to be. You are supposed to innovate on familiar semantic domains. So you draw on, if you're trying to be metaphorically ingenious in Persian, you innovate on horsemanship, the moth and the candle, silk making, but you don't innovate on a completely unfamiliar domain, which is also equivalent, which is also the same, which is the same case for Braj, right? So it's not because it's not by him that the metaphors are different. The metaphors are, I don't want to say they're not vivid, they're different because you don't exploit those semantic domains in Braj. Anyway, they're not by him, they're attributed to him. How do we know they're not by him? Because firstly, he doesn't take credit for them, and he loves taking credit for things. He loves flashing his CV at you all the time, right? Even in his old age, which is kind of useful for us because we know what he took pride in. And there's only one point at which that I can think of in 1293, in the preface to his third divan, where he takes pride in having invented a trilingual pun. He says, before me, people punned across two languages, Arabic and Persian, they produce two meanings. Yeah, I have invented a pun that yields 7 meanings across 3 languages. And the languages are Hindi. He calls it Hindi. It's probably some kind of medieval Hindi. Arabic and Persian, right? Now, that's the only instance of multilingual or translingual poetry that I can think of. He composes a little poem that you can parse as Arabic, Persian, and Hindi. It's an ingenious little poem, but that's it. There's nothing else.
The kind of contradiction and conflict you talked about in his genre or the individual, was it specific to Khusraw or the entire genre? Because in Rubaiyat it was not there.
Yeah, no, you see this...
it was there in Rubaiyat because I've read some of it.
In the Rubaiyat?
Yeah.
Not in the Rubaiyat. I mean, I don't see the conflict in the Rubaiyat. You see it because the Rubaiyat are kind of... they're free of conflict. They're actually shockingly this-worldly. Right?
This speaks more about Khusraw than the genre.
Khusraw and Nizami. You know, I mentioned a poet called Nizami, 12th century poet. Khusraw, this sort of autobiographical, misgivings that he foregrounds. Nizami also does that. Why it happens is another question, but yeah.
Prashant, what did you think of his individual self?
Yeah, so individuality is an interesting, we tend to, I suppose most of us today tend to think of individuality as a feature of liberal thought, liberalism, right? That's certainly how it comes to, its most salient presence in modern India is through British and then colonial liberalism as a philosophy, right? Which is no older than the 18th century in a way, right? But individuality is a much older history, right? What's striking and actually very, pleasurable about, for us, one of the sort of almost familiar features of this body of medieval literature in Persian and Arabic is it's this strong sense of authorial individuality you get, which is a completely pre-modern sense of individuality. I'll explain in a moment. Both Nizami, writing in what is now Azerbaijan in Persian, and Khusraw are men of no noble origin, right? And they're actually proud of being ancestrally nobodies, right? Khusraw's father and grandfather were manumitted slaves, probably bought as boys from Central Asia and sold into India, right? And Khusraw's mother was the daughter of a nobleman, Indian nobleman. But Khusraw and Nizami are proud of coming from very humble origins, and yet, having accomplished this much, they basically what the sort of attitude is: look how not ignoble, but how humble and obscure my origins are, and yet look how much I've accomplished, right? It's a kind of meritocracy, right? That undercuts the emphasis placed on paternity and descent in the Shahnama, in the Book of Kings, right? Where you have to be the son of an Iranian king to be the king of Iran, right? It's an anti-epic posture which undercuts paternity in favor of individual exertion and merit. Why is it not like the American ideal of the self-made man? Because your ability to exert yourself and achieve something as an individual is God-given, right? It's not because of your own, it's because God singled you out, right? So it's a medieval model of individuality. It's not, it's not a sort of American capitalist model of individuality, right? So, yeah.
I had a question. Can I go ahead?
Oh, okay, either one. Anyone.
Prashant, I was hoping at the end when you were talking about Saeed and late style, that you would say a little bit more about how you theorize style through this text. I felt like you didn't finish your thought there. Is style only improvisation? Is style aesthetic, or is there something more to style? Can you speak to those questions?
Yeah, it is those things, the latter things you said, but the reason it's what Said also describes in that book is because the poem as a whole keeps contradicting itself in its postures. And what Edward Said says when he's talking about certain kinds of novelists and musicians, all European and American, is that you see these works produced sometimes quite late in their lives, in their careers, which are formally fractured, but not for want of mastery, but precisely at the peak of their mastery. So they wanted it fractured, right? You could say it's modernist in a way, you know, that's how Picasso's Guernica maybe, but he's not interested only in modernism, right? He's speaking of a spectrum of music and literature. And for him, this is a mark of, I think, what he calls unreconciled hostility to reality as the poet or artist or musician knows it in her or his old age, right? Now, the reality in question here with which Khusraw seems unreconciled is a subjective one. It's his relationship with God, right, that he feels tormented about because he spent his life or career exalting and pursuing or exploring linguistic shapes in all their, in every sense of the phrase linguistic shapes, figures of speech, you know, metaphors, genres. This poem alone contains at least, how many genres? It contains 5, 6, 7, 8 genres in one poem, right? Never been done before. He's very proud of it. He speaks of himself, you know, as singular in the world. He can't see himself in the mirror. Mercury has to come down and talk to him, and yet he's completely ashamed of it as well.
Yeah, my question.
Yeah.
Prashant, could you just tell us a little bit about the 9 skies, how they're distinguished from each other, and yet how they come together to make the entire poem?
Yeah, they're distinguished by theme and rhythm mainly, right? So the first sky is rather free of wordplay, and that's the 9th, the outermost sky. The second one, sorry about that. 1 second. Yeah, that one. This is the first sky, the outermost, right? It's sort of linguistically it's lexically lucid rather than dense. It uses this heroic meter. The 8th sky describes Khusraw Khan's successful march on the Kakatiya capital of Warangal and his restoration of tributary relations with Prataparudra. Again, the 3rd sky is on India, as I said. It resumes the battle narrative at the end, but it's sort of, this guy, he invents a meter in honor of India, right? It doesn't exist, that meter doesn't exist in Arabic or Persian, he invents it. But if you actually scan the meter and you read it aloud, I think, when I did it, that it sort of sounds, it's rhythmically identical to Shragmani in Sanskrit, which is a hymnal meter in Sanskrit, right? So it's perhaps for hymnal reasons that he's actually, it fits the topic, right? So it's rhythmically very innovative. All of the skies are, but this sky in particular, 3rd sky. The 6th sky, so I have Jupiter. This is the one where, this is the kind of the plainest one. And this is the one he finds arguably the hardest to write because he says it. He says, you know, I'm obliged to offer advice. And this is a book of akhlaq. Akhlaq means royal ethics, right? In the Aristotelian tradition. And he offers the king advice on how to conduct, and his not just the king, but the king's generals as well. This body of advice is in line with the Sharia. Don't exploit peasants. Don't levy heavy taxes on the peasantry because they are your revenue base, right? Your fiscal basis, and so forth. The 5th sky is sky of Mars. This is the hunting, the Shikarnama, right? But also the conversation between the bow and the arrow. And his choice of rhythms, apart from the Sanskrit, equivalent 3rd sky, his choice of rhythms has antecedents, right? So why would he choose this particular meter, the khafif, for this meter? Because it had been used in the century before his, by a particular poet for a mystical allegory, right? 4th sky of the sun, glory, fame, hence the Prince Muhammad's birth, right? 3rd sky, spring, the meter, is one of I think the 2nd most common meter in the Persian language, a meter that had been used famously in the previous century for a patriotic poem by a Persian poet, Iranian poet. 2nd sky on Mercury, it praises India's winter, Hindustan, North India's winter, which is mild in contrast to Khorasan, what is today Afghanistan and Iran. And it sets up a conversation between the Sultan's mallet and polo ball. You see a painting of a polo game, horse polo game here. The innermost sky is his conversation with Mercury. Yeah, so that's the layout. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Prashant. That was fascinating. Just bear with me. I'm just sort of entertaining a half-formed thought. I'm really fascinated by this ambivalence that you talked about, and I was wondering, I'm not. How would you think it's reducible just to shame? Because clearly, this is a very well-wrought, almost like a very self-contained cosmology, which could be as well-wrought as a good medieval, literary work could be.
Yeah.
And if then his sense of sort of subjectivity derives from this sense of exertion of an effort, which is in turn God-given,
Yeah.
then this as a sort of an exemplification is too weak a word for what he's doing, a sort of almost like a display of it is in some sense the use of that God-given gift.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't actually,
So I was wondering if perhaps one way of looking at this ambivalence is also yet another sort of modesty topos rather than shame. A kind of a modesty topos, not necessarily shame as like a subjective
it's hard.
shame.
It's very, you're right. Because as I said, when he says I'm ashamed, he's punning.
Right. Yeah.
And all those puns give the lie to the shame. So is he really ashamed? Does he mean what he says, or is he actually being tongue-in-cheek, right? A modesty topos. But then there are other lines which are free of puns, and they're just sort of, they're dark, and he's ashamed of having been basically an impious Muslim.
Right.
So there's a failure of piety. So it's impossible for me to come up with a clear...
No, it's a fascinating reading, just to read ambivalence.
Which is why I thought, in a way, Said's idea of late style might be a kind of umbrella term.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thanks.
What's that? Close? Yeah.
Chandan has a question.
Prashant, I didn't see the last thing closely enough, but I'm going to ask anyway. The unreconciled hostility to reality in late age. But his claim of having become a child again, is that hostility or a certain taking pride in having been able to see reality again with a certain lightness, without the heavy burdens of adult knowledge? Or, or just being able to be more at one with the world around, let's not use words like mediation, etc. But
right.
No better childhood can befall the heart.
Yeah.
Child absorbed in its own play.
Possibly that's a plausible reading. Yeah. But this is perhaps not so much a formulation of shame. There are others. I should have chosen a better passage. This is ambivalent, right? But he speaks of himself as a child who's distracted by his own play and therefore not paying attention to his own renown. But then his own renown is just the knocking of 2 leather cups, which is to say there is no drum roll of glory, right? So, not entirely. Yeah. This is a hard question to answer. It's also close to Divya's question in a way, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, in the same kind of series of questions. It's a bit surprising if one thinks of these big machines like Dante, and to see somebody starting with the big picture and getting back on Earth.
Yeah.
And so, sorry.
Yeah.
This question of the point of view and of the idea to start with the fixed stars.
Yeah.
I haven't opened Aristotle in a long time, but I guess if my memory serves that he also tends to go from the where we are to the explanation of the
Khusraw
principles.
is more Platonic than Aristotelian. So.
But Plato also has this, right? There is this scaling.
Depends which dialogue. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
So the question is why this order? Does it correspond to a certain genre? Does it correspond to? It is very strange. And also, are there like multiple sub-principles of organization in terms of colors? Because we saw lots of red. So are there kind of, I don't know, things associated with the planets in terms of
Colors, no, but you know, associations like Mars is war, military. Mars is belligerent. Jupiter is the scribe of the sky.
I mean, is there an alchemical dimension? Is there
Alchemical, no, but there are iconographic associations, right? So Jupiter is presented. That's why I included these paintings as well. I mean, these paintings are not illustrations of his poem, but you know, I mean, this is actually an illustration of this particular poem, a scene of Prince Muhammad's education from 17th century Iran. It's a manuscript from 17th century Iran, which I used actually for my translation as well. But yeah, I mean, is there a genre like this? I don't think so. I looked and looked and I couldn't find anything in medieval Persian or Arabic which unfolds according to a scheme of the planets, right? There is Nizami's work, Haft Pekar, which is sort of 7 figures, 7 domes, and that unfolds according to the 7 planets. Well, yeah, 7 planets. That's the closest analog. 7 planets there. But those 7 planets are actually also, they correspond to the 7 pleasure domes that King Bahram builds for his 7 wives, which correspond to the 7 days of the week, each of which has its own color. And in each dome, each wife tells him a tale, a story, a kind of a folk tale at night, after which he makes love to her. But each tale has a sort of moral, you know, a moral that, according to me, on my reading, plays havoc with the structure of the skies. So the kind of macro structure is interfered with by the microstructure of the tales, right? That's perhaps his closest model. But otherwise, I can't think of anything else.
And there are no numerological concerns also associated?
Not in this poem.
And a very technical question and brief on the translation. So you translated consistently in decasylab, more or less?
Yeah, iambic pentameter.
Oh, pentameters.
Unrhymed, so it's blank. It's the same meter as Milton's Paradise Lost. So basically unrhymed iambic pentameter.
And at some point I saw there was an enchantment between the smoky and the sky or something.
Yeah, that happens in moments of excitement.
Okay,
When
so
he's
that's in the
excited, he
text.
wants you to be excited, it spills across 2 or more couplets.
That's in the original.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, and on that note, I'd like to bring a close to the
Thank
session.
you, Sandhya, very much for indulging us, and it's close to 8. So.
Of course, thanks to Prashant Keshavmurthy for his session. Thanks to all of you for being here. Good night.